Good afternoon here on the East Coast. Good morning on the West Coast. Good evening in Europe and Asia. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service. And it's a great pleasure to welcome SFS alumni from around the world to the latest edition of our Fast Break series. Today, we have with us a newcomer, actually, to the Georgetown family. Yuri Zhukov joined us relatively recently as a new associate professor in the School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government. He came to us from the University of Michigan and after a visiting professorship at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is an expert on the causes, the dynamics, and the outcomes of conflict with a particular focus on this part of the world. And he also is well known for using some of the most interesting and innovative methods to try to understand the impact of conflict and the dynamics of conflict. And right now, in fact, he has put together the most comprehensive public source of data that actually tracks day to day the progress of the military campaign of Russia against Ukraine. And who controls what territory and what cities, how that's changing on a day-to-day basis. And it uses geospatial data. It uses multiple sources to track the war. So we couldn't be happier to have such a strong expert on what's happening in the region and a strong expert on the dynamics of conflict. So welcome, Yuri. Just to let everyone know how we handle these chats, these webinar chats. This will be a conversation between Yuri and I for the next 30 minutes. I will integrate your questions into the chat in a seamless way, so we won't have a question and answer period. But if you have questions during the course of the conversation, you want to put them in the Q&A function, in particular, the Q&A function, please. I'll be monitoring that, and I will try to integrate those questions into a seamless conversation with Yuri. So with that, let me start. And Yuri, kind of bring us up to the moment, really. Yesterday, we heard that Ukraine has agreed to some kind of mineral deal with the United States in exchange for what we don't know. Just can you bring us up to date on what the latest is in the relationship between Ukraine and the United States in dealing with the next steps of this conflict?
Thank you, Joel, for the wonderful introduction. I will try to bring us up to date. The challenge about commenting on this topic is that by the time our conversation is over, a lot of what we discuss could be overturned by events, and these are obviously breaking news. So the current state of affairs is that under the semi-finalized deal, under the finalized framework for a deal, Ukraine is going to allocate 50% of future proceeds from state-owned critical mineral, oil, and gas projects to this jointly managed Ukraine Recovery Investment Fund. This fund is going to exclude existing revenue streams, so all the things that Naftogaz, the state oil and gas company for Ukraine, has been developing, that is excluded from this. This is going to focus only on untapped deposits. There are no security guarantees in this deal, which is a key demand that Zelensky put on the table when he first proposed this idea in September. But there are also some concessions from the U.S. There are no longer any ownership overrides. Initially, the Trump administration insisted on overriding Ukraine's existing trade agreements. So this new deal preserves existing partnerships with the EU and Asia. Now, Ukraine is not the biggest player in rare earths worldwide. It has significant deposits of graphite, which is a key component for electric vehicles. It has lithium, the largest European deposits of lithium, which are key for batteries, has titanium. But their deposits pale in comparison to the big players like the Chinas, the Russias, the Australias of the world, the Chiles. It's only a tiny fraction of what those players have. And there are also some potential problems with the implementation and finalization of the deal, which I'm happy to go into in greater depth.
But let's talk about the security guarantee issue, because obviously, at least from Zelensky's point of view, the whole point of trying to engage in a deal like this is to extract some form of, if not obviously continued support, material support and financial support for the war and for Ukraine's economy, given the terrible blow that this conflict has had on its economy. But obviously, the big picture is the security and the security guarantees. What are and what can be Zelensky's strategy for trying to engage on some form of security relationship or security guarantees in the aftermath of the about face of the Trump administration.
Right. So this has been a key component of the demands that Ukraine has put forth in any negotiations to settle this war. What exactly the term security guarantees means has been subject to some strategic flexibility on the part of the Ukrainians. I mean, this could mean foreign peacekeeping troops in Ukrainian soil. This could mean foreign bases. This could mean bilateral mutual defense agreements, which is probably what they were hoping to strike with the U.S., although that does not seem to be on the table anymore. It's also not exactly clear what territories these guarantees would extend to, just the territories that Ukraine controls or all of Ukraine's territory, including occupied territories. That's probably a non-starter. These security guarantees could also come in the form of NATO membership, which is just something that the U.S. has put some ice on in recent days. Because there again, you have the same challenge. Like, are we talking about just a part of Ukraine that Kyiv controls would be given NATO membership? Which is along the lines of what Zelensky has suggested. We will be kind of a West German or ROK model for the alliance membership, or we're talking about the whole country. Now this has been part of what Ukraine has wanted, along with the withdrawal of Russian forces, the return of deportees and POWs. But overall, this is probably the main demand that Ukraine has in any kind of peace settlement. They want robust third-party enforcement to back up any peace deal that comes out of this. And initially, it seemed like this would be a vehicle for it. And in recent statements that Zelensky has made since the framework was announced, he said that although there are no security guarantees in this deal, he plans to raise this question directly with Trump during his meeting with him in the White House, which has been planned for the next few days and next few weeks. We don't know for certain the date yet.
Well, that's thinking about the future and the future guarantees. Just actually also bring us up to date on what the current state of the reality is. One question already came in. What is the reality on the front line? You monitor this on a daily basis. Are Russians increasing their advance? Does it look like, I mean, the key question is, does it look like the terms are shifting in a way that Ukraine really cannot withstand the strength of the Russian assault, especially given weakening U.S. support for its military efforts beyond the future guarantees? Where are we now?
Right. So we are right now pretty much where we were a couple of years ago. If we look at it from a big picture standpoint, Russia now controls just under 19% of Ukraine's territory, according to my data. By the way, those who are interested, the data are linked on my website, and if you Google Yuri Zhukov, GitHub Ukraine, it'll come up. I'll try to paste it in the chat, but seems like I'm not able to do that for the whole group. How things are going on the front are Ukraine's outside option as far as these talks concerned. Your leverage in any negotiation depends on how ready and willing you are to walk away and how attractive that outside option is relative to what you get out of the talks. Right now, Ukraine is not in the best shape from a negotiating standpoint, although the pace of the Russian offensive, which has been ongoing for over a year, has significantly slowed down in recent weeks. If you just follow the movement of the front line, they're pretty close to the administrative border with Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk at this point, putting another major Ukrainian city within sight. Pokrovsk, which is a city in the western part of Donetsk Oblast, is kind of the linchpin of Ukrainian logistics in the east. It's a place where like 5 or 6 different major roads intersect. It has largely lost its value as a logistical hub. Now Ukrainians are using a lot of other logistical routes that are that have a lower bandwidth. But overall, the Russian momentum has slowed, but there's still the situation is still such that if we project things out into the future, and after the current tranche of aid runs out, Ukraine is looking at a very hungry scenario from the standpoint of ammunition, from the standpoint of personnel especially. And we also need to be honest that the trajectory that Ukraine was on before all of this was not a positive one. They were on a trajectory to lose slowly. And the initial hope was that to enhance their bargaining leverage, there would be an influx of aid behind them to put additional pressure on Russia during these talks. That has not materialized, and there are clear political constraints to doing that within the United States right now. And Ukrainians understand that. And so right now they are looking for alternatives. They're looking to strike some kind of bargain with the EU, recognizing that there's no real way that the EU could replace the assistance that the United States has provided up to this date. So right now the front has stabilized relative to what it was about 6 months ago, but Ukraine is pretty far from what we would consider to be a comfort zone for them.
Can you talk a little bit, and one of the questions came in about what the European countries can conceivably do that would support Ukraine, given a potential about face in U.S. support? There are limits to the amount of peacekeeping force, for example, that Ukraine could put in, and Putin has already made clear his unwillingness to see European troops if we don't go via NATO. What's the realistic support besides financial and material that Europe could provide as a security buffer to Ukraine?
So the hope from about a year ago was that the bargain would be along the lines of the following: that Europe would cover a lot of the costs associated with keeping the Ukrainian government up and running, and they'll provide humanitarian assistance, while the U.S. would specialize on military aid. Now, the U.S. has not formally stepped away from its commitment to provide military aid as of yet. Just everything is currently held up, and there's some funds that are trying to that are making their way still through the system. But ultimately, there are certain key capabilities that the U.S. has provided that Europe cannot, particularly on the intelligence side. Europe cannot replace the constellation of satellites that the U.S. has in orbit. Europe cannot replace also Starlink, on which the Ukrainian troops have become very dependent. There are some things they can do in terms of providing 155 shells and providing barrel replacements, a few things here and there, and some long-range strike capabilities. But in terms of the overall volume, that is going to precipitously drop, even if right now Europe, as it seems to be doing, is kind of woken up and trying to consolidate its efforts and rally around Ukraine. Even the most extensive mobilization of these resources is not going to be able to make up what would be lost with the withdrawal of the U.S. from the situation, and potentially with the looming U.S. withdrawal of forces from Europe.
So let's turn our attention now to Russia and Russia's interest in this and Russia's negotiating position and strategy. So what is Putin looking to get from this new and unexpected opening of a relationship with the United States? What do you think his negotiating strategy is going to be in terms of what he is going to be seeking in any agreement? And kind of the simple question: where do you think this is going to go in terms of Russia's new opening of an engagement with the United States on this question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Russia's terms have not become more modest over time. If anything, their appetite has grown. And if we use as a benchmark what their demands were at the outset of the war, let's say the Istanbul talks in March of 2022, or even earlier, the ultimatum that they made to the U.S. and to the West, roll NATO back to the 1997 borders or else. Their terms are basically the following. On the international level, neutrality for Ukraine, no Ukraine in NATO, no foreign military presence, including peacekeepers, no matter what banner they're under. They also want to tie any agreement on Ukraine to discussions on NATO's military posture in Eastern Europe. They have not backed away from their demilitarization and denazification demands. So what demilitarization means is basically Weimar Republic-style constraints on the Ukrainian military. They want Ukraine's withdrawal from regions annexed by Russia. They are also demanding a maximum of 50,000 troops for Ukraine's military, a maximum of 400 tanks, no long-range strike, a maximum of 40-kilometer range for any missile systems that Ukraine has. And those demands have actually become more severe since Istanbul. You would think that after losing hundreds of thousands of troops, Russia would moderate these demands, but no. In terms of what denazification means, I mean, it really just means regime change in Kyiv. That's what the election demand is about. They also demand constitutional reforms, granting Russian the status of an official state language. On the economic front, they want sanctions lifted. Any deal on Ukraine is going to have to be tied to sanctions relief. They also want Ukraine to pay reparations for damage done to Russian-occupied areas. So people are often talking about borders and like, where's the line going to be drawn? Is it going to be along the current line of demarcation on the front? Is it going to be something else? Is Russia going to get to keep Crimea? This war is not about borders. It never has been. But insofar, it primarily has been about the political domination of Ukraine. But as far as borders are concerned, freezing the conflict at the current front line is not acceptable to Russia. They have been clear about this. They want new realities to be recognized, which is to say, retain their current control of annexed territories beyond actually the territories they control, up to the administrative borders. And so this is actually an escalation of their demands compared to what we're seeing on the Ukrainian side. In terms of the leverage that they have coming into this, they're feeling pretty good right now. They're facing a fractured Western alliance. They're facing a U.S. that has signaled its eagerness to make a deal. If your opponent wants to make a deal more than you do, that gives you a huge advantage in negotiations. U.S. has already made significant concessions on NATO, on elections, on security guarantees, on accountability measures. No one's talking about war crimes tribunals anymore. No one's talking about Russian reparations anymore. And there's a ratchet effect with these kinds of concessions. With every concession that you make, even before talks begin, becomes an irreversible benchmark for future demands. Russians understand this. So even though like this can potentially have some benefit, this buttering up of the opponent before talks begin, it actually has the effect of narrowing the bargaining range in Russia's favor. And Russians realize this. Their outside option is also much more attractive than Ukraine's. They can keep fighting more easily than Ukraine can. They've demonstrated an ability to withstand sanctions and maintain the war effort. And crucially, their bargaining position is anchored by a commitment device in the form of annexing formally these 4 regions of Ukraine along with Crimea. But when you make a public statement that limits your ability to back down later on, that enhances your bargaining position. So this ties not only Putin's hands, this ties the hands of any political successor in Russia. They would have to change the constitution in order to make territorial concessions. And that is why freezing the war at the current front line is a no-go for Russia. They will not accept that. And so they're responding to these concessions from the U.S. by doing what a rational actor would, asking for more.
So what do you think that they might give up in their negotiations with the United States, given this the scenario you paint? And actually, it's fascinating to see that despite the economic consequences of the war, despite the sort of very strong casualties, and despite the slowing of their advance, you're sort of saying that they've only escalated their demands. So what is the likelihood that Trump's going to swoop in and make a deal in which they are going to make some concessions?
So potential concessions, where we are right now, the only ones, frankly, I'm seeing as potentially EU membership for the rump state that remains of Ukraine that's not something that they have expressed feeling as threatened by NATO membership. But again, if you've shifted the bargaining range so that NATO membership is off the table, what's the next thing they're going to ask for? Okay, EU membership off the table. So they can go either way on this. In terms of recognition, that's also a potential area where they can make concessions. So if the West does not recognize these territories as being part of Russia, they might be able to live with like a Baltic states post-1945 scenario where there's a kind of de facto recognition, but not de jure recognition, where on paper the U.S. never recognized the Baltic states being part of the Soviet Union. But overall, right now, they are really thinking about what more they could demand from the United States. And there's actually, in addition to this triumphalism on their side, there are actually some voices of caution. They are worried that any potential deal that they strike with the current administration is going to be subject to the political survival of the current administration. And if If the other party wins in 2028, all this could be reversed. And also, crucially, all of this rests on a potential European collapse, right? And if Europe responds to this U.S. retrenchment by unifying, consolidating their efforts as opposed to fragmenting, then all this could potentially backfire. Although that's a long-term prospect. In the immediate term, they're very happy with where things are right now.
What do you think? And I don't know if you've had any conversations on the U.S. side, and one question came in about this. What do you think Trump will ask for? I mean, we know what he's already taken off the table. You mentioned that, the concessions that he's already made. What do you actually think they might push Russia for?
Right. So everything we've seen so far indicates a negotiating strategy that prioritizes a swift conclusion to the war rather than getting the best possible terms. Now, there are some parallels that folks have pointed out to the deal that was struck with the Taliban in Doha in 2020. There as well, the priority was to fast track the withdrawal, put all other issues on the back burner. And what this means practically is to speed things up, bilateral talks, exclude third parties like the Europeans, like Ukraine even, preemptive concessions like we've talked about, also limiting the demands, narrowing the range of what's being discussed to just basically ceasefire as much as possible. So they've taken accountability issues off the table. They've taken security guarantees largely off the table. They're applying pressure on Ukraine to try to influence Ukraine to accept a deal. But I think also a lot of that is probably aimed to get Zelensky to a deal on the minerals thing. And they're also buttering up their opponent. Now, there are potential benefits to this approach in that we've already seen it ends the diplomatic deadlock. And it creates goodwill. And the coverage that you see about the U.S. on Russian state television right now is universally positive. Almost. And this also potentially starts a cycle of reciprocity, like tit for tat. You start a tit for tat strategy by being cooperative, and then in the hopes that your opponent is going to cooperate in response. Unfortunately, that's not how the Russians have been playing this. This is not how they've interpreted this. They've interpreted this as, well, our opponent has just made several unreciprocated concessions without the seeming expectation of concessions in response from us. And as a result, you lose leverage. I mean, these concessions signal to the Russians that we have more to give than we have already given. And I think where this probably ends up is there's some kind of frozen conflict, particularly without an enforcement mechanism, of which there's not really any discussion right now. Without an enforcement mechanism behind the ceasefire, it's not clear what mechanism exists to prevent war from recurring. And also, this does not end, these kinds of talks do not end well for the excluded party. Ukraine understands this. So Doha talks did not end well for the Afghan government, which was excluded from those talks, because much like Russia, the Taliban did not see the Afghan government as a legitimate actor politically. They saw them as a puppet. But also, U.S. negotiations with North Vietnam in 1973 also cut out the South Vietnamese, did not end well for the South Vietnamese government. I mean, I'm go all the way back to Munich, although the U.S. was not a party to that. But the Czechoslovak delegation standing in the hallway while the fate is being discussed in the room definitely does not bring up good historical parallels from Ukraine's standpoint. In terms of what the U.S. is willing to concede, I think that their priority is to get to a deal as quickly as possible. That is clear from everything they're doing. If they were not doing that, I mean, you would expect them to bring third parties into negotiations to slow this down. You would expect them to open up the talks to other issues that are not currently on the table. They're not doing any of that. And so right now we're on a fast track to ending the war. And if all you care about is stopping the violence, hey, there's some goodness in that. But assuming that you do not look beyond that and what the implications are for European security.
Well, let's do that. Let's look beyond that and ask the implications, because there are questions already coming in about that very thing. Look, let's assume that the war ends on these terms, highly favorable to Russia, America not pushing for strong concessions, Ukraine being essentially, and I appreciate the historical parallels you made. When you're not at the table, you generally, your interests are not represented. So what do you think post-conflict, post-frozen conflict, what are I think, what are Putin's intentions? Is this the basis, as some Europeans fear, for him to take even more potentially aggressive action in the Baltics, elsewhere? And you raise the possibility that the Europeans, either through European accession or through a greater unification of European engagements to support Ukraine, while U.S. is not pushing on the opposite direction. What does a world look like in which Putin got what he wanted? How does he approach European security? And what does U.S.-European relations look like in the aftermath of this kind of frozen peace?
So what is not going to happen is NATO is not going to be rolled back to 1997 borders, which is a demand that Russia made before the beginning of the invasion. But frankly, there's no expulsion mechanism. NATO cannot legally remove a member like Poland or Lithuania. And so there's no treaty mechanism for that. All members have to basically voluntarily dissolve and reconstitute the alliance to change its membership structure. It is, however, possible for the U.S. to unilaterally withdraw from the alliance, and that's something that the Russians are really hoping happens. Now, this requires congressional approval, 2/3 Senate vote, I believe. But you'd be easily able to find legal scholars in the United States who will debate whether this law can actually bind the president, as treaty termination is traditionally something that resides with executive power. So this is going to be another legal battle if we reach that. There are precedents for this. France, withdrew from NATO's integrated military command in '66. Greece did the same in '74. The U.S. can also unilaterally withdraw its military forces from Europe, particularly if that is being discussed right now. The current plans are to withdraw at least 20% of the U.S. contingent in Europe, and kind of bringing the permanent troop presence down from 10,000 to 80,000. That's what's currently on the table. It could be more, it could be less. And this has implications for deterrence, particularly in two places. One of them is more severe than the other. So the first is the Suwalki Gap, which is this 21st century equivalent of the Fulda Gap from the old NATO day, Cold War days. 65-kilometer strip of land along the Poland-Lithuania border that is sandwiched between the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and Poland and Belarus. And this is pretty much the place where everybody expects World War III to break out. In fact, the students in my class at Georgetown on Russia, I have them play a command and staff exercise where they put themselves in the role of the Russian general staff. They play this out. So for those of you on the call who are still enrolled, if you're interested, check that out. But so U.S. rotational brigades stationed in Poland, Lithuania used to serve as tripwire forces there. Reductions in troop levels would erode this deterrent. Also, without U.S. airlift and logistical support, European allies are going to lack the capacity to reinforce this gap under fire. Without U.S. intelligence and satellites, European allies are going to be going into this, pretty blind. This is all honestly very, very troubling. Also, because Russia's 2024 Zapad exercises with Belarus focused on this exact scenario. Now, the other potential flashpoint is Moldova. I think U.S. withdrawal plans are going to have less direct effect on security of non-NATO members, but there, we could potentially see a more emboldened Russia trying to either through political subversion or through some limited incursions, clip the wings of the Moldovan government. The problem there is it's actually harder for the Russians to get there than to the Baltic states. It's landlocked. They would have to breach Ukrainian airspace. Ukrainians are probably going to have something to say about that. But those are the two flashpoints I would look at right now. What is happening in the Suwalki Gap, and how credible is the NATO commitment to the defense of the Baltic states? And what can be said about extending deterrence to potentially non-NATO members? I think that proposition is getting very dicey.
Well, I'm going to ask you one last question, because we do like to keep these to 30 minutes, and we can talk about many, many things. There's so much that to unpack here. But look, you're a scholar of conflict, and you think a lot about the implications of reputation, peace through strength, which is the Trump administration's view of how it's conducting U.S. foreign policy. What do you think the implications are of where this conflict is likely to end and how this conflict is likely to end? What does that bode for the perception of U.S. power outside of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, People have asked about Taiwan. People have asked about others in the non-NATO space. You talked about Moldova, Georgia. What does this say about the projection of U.S. power abroad?
Well, it could very well be that all this will work out, and Ukraine and Europe will respond by bolstering their own defenses, becoming a much more independent player on the world stage. But ultimately, what we're seeing right now is the world is having to adjust to, at a minimum, a lot more uncertainty, and they're being forced to dust off old contingency plans that they did not know they would need to utilize. A lot of the European security and defense rests on the assumption that they will be going into this together with the United States. They have no off-the-shelf plans for going against Russia alone. The same thing with Taiwan and peninsula security and the Koreas. Everybody's going to try to send signals about, I guess, the internal balancing that they're going to be doing, to borrow a realist term from IR, and bolstering their defense budgets, increasing their domestic arms production. And so we should see defense budgets rise. We should see the stocks rise for defense contractors around the West and around East Asia. Yeah, ultimately, this is a case where, hey, elections have consequences. And this is a big one, potentially the most dramatic development in global security since the end of the Cold War.
Well, I got to ask you, and I know it's just one extra minute to say, so Zelensky is coming. What would you recommend? What public stance and maybe private stance should he be taking in these negotiations? And then we'll call it for the remainder of the webinar. Go ahead.
Well, since the U.S. negotiating strategy entails excluding third parties, their number one priority is not to be excluded, is to insist on being, at least having their voices heard and represented in the talks. So slow things down, insist on their being included, potentially introduce new demands, but also because Ukraine is likely to be excluded from the bilateral talks between Russia and the U.S., their main points of leverage are going to come during the ratification stage. And so delegating this decision-making authority to the parliament, to the Rada, is a potential source of leverage by Zelensky. In fact, all of the major opposition parties in Ukraine have already spoken out against the minerals deal. And so Zelensky can be in a position where he can point to them and say, well, look, my hands are tied. You have to satisfy them. You don't just have to satisfy me. With all that, of course, he's testing the patience of the Trump administration, but still, that's the one source of leverage that he has. It also has to signal their willingness to walk away from a bad deal. Ukrainian public opinion is a huge source of leverage. And Ukrainian public opinion is both against elections. While the war is going on, they're against this deal without security guarantees. And that's the main source, the main bargaining chip that he has to play. I live in a democracy. I'm accountable to the people. And, it's not up to me, it's up to them.
Well, look, thank you, Yuri, for your insights. I really especially appreciated the historical dimension of this, and your deep understanding of what's happening on the ground. For those of you who haven't seen it, in the webinar chat function is the link to Yuri Zhukov's website, as well as the latest data that he's monitoring on a day-by-day basis. It's really extraordinary and an important contribution that Yuri and his team are making to helping everyone around the world understand the nature of Russia's advance and Ukraine's effort to push back on this. And we will continue to use those sources as an important data source as we go forward. Thank you very much to SFS alumni around the world for joining us for another Fast Break. These are coming fast and furious as the nature of the global order is shifting so much. So I suspect I will see you again relatively soon for another Fast Break on another head-shattering, head-spinning set of issues as the global order changes right before our eyes. Thank you, Yuri. Thank you all for joining us.